So I know that you have a lot going on today with all of the different sessions, and so I want to make sure that we're going to manage our time accordingly, so I'm going to get right to it. We're going to talk about an important topic, people. And I love the introduction. Thank you for that. Because employee relations and also human resource management, those two things kind of go hand in hand. So specifically what we're going to talk about this morning is responsibilities for people and managing conflict and also managing the compliance to make sure that people are really treated fairly. So key things with the agenda. We're going to spend some time really understanding the current trends. What's happening in employee relations with organizations? Doesn't matter whether you're the Florida Conference or whether you are GE. We employ people, and we have to make sure that the way that we're taking care of people is within the boundaries of laws and also aligned with our values and our mission. All right? And then we're going to drill down specifically and learn a little bit more about managing conflict, roles, responsibilities, and then we're going to wrap it up and talk about performance management and documentation. I know, Yasmin, you and I have talked a lot about that over the time we've known each other. All right. So what is employee relations? Can someone tell me? How do you define it? It's all about people, right? Yeah, day-to-day interactions, right. It's really about kind of people infrastructure. And so I like to kind of use this example. So my nephew, Ryan, he's a lovely, lovely young guy. He's a safety and maintenance manager at Hershey Park. If any of you are familiar with Hershey Park in Pennsylvania, if you've never been, it's just the greatest place on the planet. There's chocolate everywhere, right? So it's chocolate and snow cones and funnel cakes and all things that are just cool amusement park stuff. But, you know, Ryan is a guy that's responsible for safety and maintenance on the Super Duper Looper and all of the other machinery that they have. All right, why is his job so important? Because if he isn't kind of taking care of the park infrastructure and making sure that everything is oiled and lubricated and safe at welding, right? He's a welder. He has to make sure that the welds are secure for obvious reasons. If rides are down, that affects the guest experience, doesn't it? And it certainly is going to affect safety. People are coming with their families to have a really enjoyable day at the park, and if he doesn't do his job and kind of manage and nurture, and boy, he really does consider those rides like his children, right? He does a fabulous job on that maintenance. And so I really want you to think about employee relations as being responsible for nurturing that kind of people infrastructure, right? That's the job of a leader in, listening, but also having that compassion, the human element. I completely agree. Sometimes with human resources management, we kind of forget the human part. We're so focused on policies and procedures, right? So really important. Now, when we talk about what's going on in employee relations, sometimes things can be a little dysfunctional, all right? So imagine for a moment in Ryan's environment with the amusement park, if there are things that haven't really been taken care of, such as the Super Duper Looper hasn't been lubricated and a few of the welds have actually gotten unsecure. And now their safety inspectors have come in and whoop, shut the ride down. Okay, so in our environment in day-to-day and managing an organization, well, we might have unscheduled absenteeism. Well, how does that affect your programs? How does that affect a camp that you're going to run, right? How does that affect some of the other community things that you do? That means that now you're working short-staffed. There's also issues with expensive turnover, right? Internal investigations, which I'm going to have another session where we're going to spend a lot more time learning about that. But also the increased risk of regulatory fines and litigation. All right, does anybody know what the average cost is for a labor attorney per billable hour today? Want to guess? Yeah, about $500 to $550 an hour. Ooh. Yeah, we want to avoid that. Okay, that's kind of expensive. All right. So the other thing that's also a problem sometimes when we have dysfunction is lack of alignment with an organization's mission. And sometimes you have individuals that are kind of going a little bit rogue, right? Not good. That means if somebody on Ryan's team that's supposed to do the proper safety inspections on the roller coaster and they're kind of not aligned with direction and safety, that becomes problematic, right? So same thing. All right, so let's talk a little bit about trends. Okay, so what are the common issues going on in organizations today? All right, my clicker's a little sticky here. All right, so unprofessional conduct. What do you think that means? What's unprofessional conduct? I bet disrespecting, talking down to people, condescending, right? Bullying, harassment, discrimination, right? These are the things that do go on, unfortunately, in organizations. And so this is what leads to some serious dysfunction. And then it also leads to internal investigations. Right. Okay, so root causes to internal investigations, conflicts, all right? Disparity in workstation assignment, scheduling, bickering, gossiping, right? Inappropriate behavior without accountability, okay? So there's a word that we're gonna focus on in the beginning and then also at the end of my presentation, right? Accountability, okay? It's almost a dirty word sometimes, right? Accountability, all right? Because that means that someone has to own it. They have to admit that they've been making a mistake, and a supervisor needs to talk with them about it. But sometimes that isn't always happening, and we're going to talk about why that is, okay? All right. So the other thing that we're seeing show up in HR is at the time of disciplinary action, you have employees that are now raising allegations of discrimination or raising allegations of harassment, because in some cases they are not necessarily embracing the fact that they may have made some mistakes and they are being held accountable. And sometimes they pivot to using what are called protected characteristics, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. All right, so now learning about the rules. So just like my nephew, when he's doing his job as a safety and maintenance manager, he has to understand the rules, the regulations. What do I need to do to keep the rides going? What do I need to do to keep those maintained? He has to manage within those boundaries. So do we, all right? So federal equal employment opportunity laws, you may have seen EEO on job postings, right? What that means is that we are an equal employment opportunity employer, and we are not going to discriminate, harass, or retaliate against anyone for any of these reasons. So in 1964, we had Title VII of the Civil Rights Act that created the first 5 protected characteristics: race, color, sex, religion, national origin. Then the other laws came later. So let's take a look at the first one. All right, so this is an iconic photo with Dr. Martin Luther King in the background when the Civil Rights Act was being passed into law. So these are the first 5 protected characteristics. And this means that you cannot in any way harass, discriminate, or retaliate because of one of these reasons. Okay, so what's an example of discrimination? Well, I myself was discriminated against. Years ago, I interviewed for a position. 25 candidates, narrowed it down to me, and also one other candidate. The leader was a female. Her name was Julie. And we sat down when we were talking about the job, and she said, "You know what, Natalie, I like you. And I hear great things from your boss. But here's my dilemma." She said, "I already have a very dynamic group of females in my department. And you know, because of that, I just don't think I need another strong female. This time, I think I just have to pick the guy." Yeah. And I was astonished. But that's exactly what discrimination is, all right? So here she was thinking that she just wanted to change up the group dynamics a little bit and just have more, just balance out the genders, and that sort of worked for her. That's illegal to do that, all right? As is the other protected characteristics as well. All right, so the next one is pregnancy discrimination. All right, pretty self-explanatory. We need to be kind to our moms. That means that when you have an employee in the workplace who is pregnant or intending to become pregnant, right, we cannot in any way harass, discriminate, or retaliate. It also means a woman who is pregnant needs to be allowed to work as long as she would like, right? Sometimes we kind of think with our heart and we say, well, perhaps we need to just move you into another position that's a little bit better for you. Okay, careful. All right, if you're pregnant and you want to stay in the position, fine, as long as you're able to perform the work safely, but you cannot just arbitrarily move a pregnant employee, all right? Okay, so the next one is the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. This one is new, and some of you might not be familiar with this. This became effective in 2023. This requires that we grant reasonable accommodations for our moms, right? Expectant moms. So certainly, I think we probably already do some nice accommodation around that. However, one of the things that's important is that this law is different than what we saw before under the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. This law allows an employer to remove essential functions temporarily. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. What might be an essential function for a position here? Maybe Yasmin, you can give me an essential function. What would be something that would be an essential function in a job here? Any jobs requiring lifting, maybe?
Lifting or communication.
Lifting, communication. Okay, let's go with lifting or walking. Right. So before this law, we did not have the ability to just remove an essential function from a job temporarily until after delivery of the child. That is new. That is different now. So what that means is that you may temporarily remove the essential function, and then that does not alter the job description entirely. All right, so that's kind of a big change from where we were before. Okay, so now moving on, age discrimination in employment. All right, so we probably have a few folks that are kind of in my age bracket, the over 40 group. All right, so this means that you cannot just separate someone because they are over the age of 40. Do you know they used to? Right? Used to be that at age 65 or age 70, well, that's it, it's just time you retire. Well, that changed, luckily. Now, if you have someone who is 97 years old, or like my father who's 81 going on 35, right, that you are able to stay in the workplace as long as you want to, as long as you're performing your functions of your job. All right, so we can't harass, discriminate, or retaliate against those who are over the age of 40. All right, so that means no just, oh, wow, well, we just don't think Charlie is really going to want the promotion because Charlie's soon going to retire. Okay, that's not okay. You can't just make those kinds of assumptions. That's discriminatory. All right, Title I of the ADA. All right, so just recently I was in Pennsylvania and I got a chance to visit my family, and it was my dad's birthday. But I also got to see my cousin Paulie. He has cerebral palsy, gives the best hugs ever. And so the ADA is near and dear to my heart because I have a cousin who has a severe disability. And the ADA is designed to give a level playing field, right? To be fair, to give people opportunities, equal employment opportunity. So this means you cannot harass, discriminate, or retaliate based on disability. But we also must grant reasonable accommodations. All right, someone give me an example. What would be a reasonable accommodation for an employee? What do you think? Yeah, maybe raising a desk to accommodate a wheelchair, right? You could also adjust schedules. You could maybe arrange for a different work location, perhaps, if maybe they need to be closer to some medical facilities. There are a lot of things we can do. And do you know most accommodations are less than $500? They're not terribly expensive. But do keep in mind it is an employer responsibility. This is a huge part of regulatory compliance today, especially the law was amended back in 2011 and has expanded the ADA. Okay, so the next one is an important one as well, Immigration Reform and Control Act. This means that in no way can we discriminate against individuals who are not citizens, right? We do have to make sure people are documented to work in the U.S., but if they do have the documentation, we may not harass, retaliate, or discriminate. Okay, and then also USERRA, all right? My husband is a retired sergeant major. Anybody from the Army here? Anybody? Anybody served in the Army? No? I was going to say HUA, which is their normal call for the Army. All right. My husband is a retired sergeant major, and on 9/11, my husband was activated to active duty. He used to work at Bell South, and he stayed on active duty for 5 years and then rotated back to his civilian employer. All right, so as an employer, you need to ensure you're not harassing, discriminating, or retaliating. You see the pattern? No harassing, no discriminating, and no retaliating based on military service, past, present, or future military service. Okay, Gina, all right, this one is a fairly new one. What this means is that you cannot harass, discriminate, or retaliate based on family medical history, all right? So let's say you have an employee who comes to you and shares, oh, wow, I just found out that my mom has breast cancer. Okay, empathy, right? We listen, we offer some empathy. I'm really sorry to hear about that. But then don't continue. Don't say, oh, well, does that run in your family? Okay, don't go there. Gathering more information about family medical history could be problematic if later on, perhaps, you might have an employee that goes on to a performance improvement plan or something like that, and it leads to a separation. You're finding out a whole lot about the other family medical history could actually give rise to claims of discrimination based on genetic information. Okay, so careful. And you certainly don't want to be like a grocery store chain, grocery store warehouse that supports a chain in Atlanta. Their supervisors decided to actually collect saliva samples from some of their employees. Unfortunately, they had a need for, at least they thought, to collect saliva samples. And sadly, there was someone who was actually defecating in the warehouse. Human waste, yes, in the warehouse. The managers wanted to conduct their own little detective sort of thing to see who was actually doing that. Well, they gathered all the saliva samples from their employees, sent it off to a laboratory to see if there would be a match. By the way, it wasn't a match. How much do you think that case cost them when they got sued by their employees for collecting their DNA? About $3 million, all right? $3 million. That's a whole lot of broccoli, right? Okay, in that grocery store warehouse. Okay, so now moving on. So now we've laid the groundwork for what I call the boundaries, right? All of the labor and employment laws that we just talked, well, employment laws that are EEO laws, but we also have some other labor laws as well, but we don't have time to get into that in this session. But we have to talk about our job as leaders, all right? So how many of you in the room supervise others? I'd like to see a show of hands. All right, so quite a few of you have direct reports, good. So let's talk about your role and responsibility in really accomplishing business results while also balancing risk. Let's take a look. Okay, supporting organizational culture. All right, how do you define culture here at the Florida Conference? How do you define it? What's an organization's culture? Yeah, right, the environment, the atmosphere, right, okay, good. The values of the organization, fantastic, right. And so what that means is that we have to be very careful sometimes that we're not so focused on one side of the equation with focusing on results. All right, imagine if my nephew, Ryan, was so focused on results. Well, get that Comet roller coaster back up and running because, well, we're going to not be able to have that ride shut down. Get on it, get on it, get on it. And if he says, well, you know, I don't have the right lubricant or I don't have a part to fix the chain, I don't care, get it done. Okay, if safety is really their culture, what can happen sometimes in day-to-day, we may deviate from what those values are, right? So we have to balance results and risks. So my nephew might say, now wait a minute, hold on a second. I understand we want to get the ride opened, but we can't do it while sacrificing safety, all right? You see? So it's a balance of results and risk. So in your organization, certainly you have responsibility for decreasing cost. We can't be wasteful with the resources that we have. You have to also think about supporting and expanding your programs. There are things that you want to accomplish that are really great and aligned with your mission, but you also have to be thinking about that risk factor, all right? So in managing risk, you have to think about safety standards. Some of you, you're running camps with kids, you're working with outdoors, things that can possibly harm them, right? We have to also be thinking about regulatory penalties. All those laws that we just talked about and kind of the boundaries of employment law, we can't in any way harass, discriminate, or retaliate, or we might be inviting legal risk, okay? And that can be expensive. And if you're not paying attention to the risk, that can also really affect you in employer reputation, right? Social media, Glassdoor, Indeed, LinkedIn, right? Keyboard warriors get out there and all of a sudden an organization can develop a bad reputation as an employer, all right? But we also have to make sure that team members, right, are taken care of, right? So we started out this morning talking about people. That's very much what we need to be doing. But that nurturing and developing our people, we need to give clear direction, but we also have to make sure that we're taking care of our teams. And that also means sometimes holding them accountable, okay? All right. So now, moving on, let's talk about some common mistakes that managers make that can really create a little bit of a wrinkle with employee relations, all right? And let's learn from this so we don't make some of these same mistakes. Okay, so not managing employee behavior and really enforcing organizational policies. Okay, why do you think supervisors do tend to shy away from actually having accountability discussions? Why do you think? It's uncomfortable, right? It's confrontation, exactly, all right? So here are some things that I want to suggest to you. Be observant with your team members every day, right? Recognize inappropriate conduct and address it privately. That is your role, your responsibility as a leader, even if it is a little uncomfortable. One of the things I'm noted for saying is we have to get comfortable as leaders and being a little uncomfortable, because that's part of the job, okay? Also, the other things we have to think about doing here is addressing the misconduct, right? And working with HR, right? We don't always have to have the right words to say or exactly what to do, but this is where you have an HR team that can support you. But we also have to make sure that we are enforcing policies, right? And that means holding people accountable. Let me use this example. So my son Taylor, he works in the aviation field, and he worked for an aerospace company for a while. And he called me the one day and he said, "Mom, can I just talk with you for a little bit, like HR stuff?" I'm like, "Oh, you want me to pull out my HR hat? Okay, this is kind of fun with my son." And he said, "Well, I'm really seriously thinking about leaving my job." And I said, "Well, T, what's going on?" He said, Well, I'm getting frustrated." He said, "I'm working really, really super long hours, and I get calls in the middle of the night." Now, mind you, they're an airline. They deal with airlines, aerospace. They serviced wheels and brakes for airplanes. So he might, at 2 o'clock in the morning, get a call from Istanbul, right, or Kazakhstan. So he said, "The problem is, one of my colleagues who works in supply chain, she's supposed to show up for the 9 o'clock team huddle every morning, and her not showing up really affects me and my team, and I find that throughout the day I have to keep going into her supply chain area to go fix things and to get information, and then she comes in late, she leaves early." And I said, "Well, okay, well, what does your boss say?" He said, "Well, that's the problem." Okay. I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, I've talked to them about it." And he said, "Well, he's had several conversations with her." Okay, so you know what those conversations were like? Haley, who is his colleague who was not really doing her job, the boss said, "Well, Haley, you really need to be at the 9 o'clock huddle, okay? So you're going to be at the 9 o'clock huddle from now on, right?" "Oh, yeah, sure. I had a childcare thing in the morning," or there was always an excuse. So that was what he considered was accountability. Okay, so she's fine for about 2 days, and then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, do you know what happened? She didn't come to the huddle. And things go right back to the way they were. And this was the repeated pattern of behavior. And eventually what my son had to do was, what do you think? What did he do? Moved on, right? He sharpened his resume and he moved on. And it was a pretty big talent loss when my son moved on. Not just because he's my boy, but he's pretty bright. And so they lost a very talented employee because of a lack of accountability. All right, so remember, this is part of your role and responsibility. Okay. So now, let's get the clicker going here. All right, another thing is jumping to conclusions. Sometimes an employee will come to you and kind of whisper a little bit in your ear and tell you maybe somebody's not doing something, okay? One of your questions should always be, how do you know that's true, okay? Just because someone shares that with you doesn't necessarily make it fact, does it? All right, so we need to ask and not jump to conclusions. How do you know that's true, okay? So my father, a good example of this is my dad in my hometown. He's known as Dan the Lance Man. Any of you remember the Lance snack food crackers? I still eat those, little Captain's wafers and soup. All right, my father worked for the Lance Snack Food Company for 34 years. He was a route salesman, and he still is. To this day, there are still people who recognize, "Hey, Dan the Lance Man," whenever we're out somewhere. All right, well, my father, back in the day when he was working, he took a 2-week vacation. He and my stepmother used to go do chili cook-offs and travel all around the country. She was actually the Pennsylvania chili champion 2 years in a row. Pretty cool. I have the recipe. I'd be willing to sell it to you. All right, okay. So Pop certainly enjoyed his vacation and his time off. They were out in Nevada at this chili competition, so obviously someone was managing his territory for sales while he was gone for 2 full weeks. Well, evidently something went sideways, and the big boss actually called and was really very unhappy with my father because he answered the phone. I mean, he literally just come in the door, set his luggage down, and the phone rang, and it was the big boss calling him. Very unhappy about this account, and expressed how disappointed he was in my father and all of this. But long pause, and then my father said, "George, you do realize that I have been on vacation, and this situation obviously happened while I was gone. Al was running my territory while I was gone." Can you say a little egg on the big boss's face? All right, so that's what we want to avoid, right? That's a common leadership mistake. So always validate your facts. Don't just leap to conclusions, okay? All right. So some other things that are problematic. All right, leaders not recognizing the difference between pushback and being insubordinate. All right, someone tell me, what is insubordination? You've heard that word used before. What does that mean? Say again, somebody louder. Okay, so insubordination is someone who truly does not follow direction. When you are a leader and you are giving someone very specific instructions of what to do, like I used to work in the car rental business years ago. You might be familiar with a brand called Ivey Rent-A-Car. So in the early part of my career, I worked in operations, outdoors. I supervised all guys. I wore work boots and had a tire gauge in my pocket and my coveralls, so I looked like a technician that would work under the hood of your car. And I had an employee named Trent who worked for me who was a frontline supervisor. I gave him very specific instructions to clean the car wash. Not a good job. I don't know if you've ever seen the bottom of a car wash. There's a lot of things that wind up there, and it's not pretty. However, we had preventative maintenance happening the following morning on the car wash, and it was necessary to clean it out so that we could have our tech come in and do all of the servicing. Well, what did Trent do? He completely just disregarded the directive that I gave him, and I explained clearly the reason why. Well, that happened to be one night where I did what's called a double back. I worked until 11 o'clock, went home, slept for a few hours, and I was back in at 6 a.m. All right, so when I see that the car wash has not been cleaned, that was time for an accountability conversation. And you know what he said? Well, it's really kind of icky. That's what he said. He used the word icky, which I thought was kind of funny. And I said, yes, I know. And I said, and it is kind of a rotation that as a manager, these are sometimes the icky things we must do. And I said, I gave you some specific instructions. Can you help me understand the reason why that didn't get carried out? And he said, well, I just really didn't want to. Okay. He said, I understand. However, let me clarify something. This was a task that really is a scope of your responsibility that needed to be done. And I said, and I gave you a specific reason why. And I said, now what we're going to need to do is scramble and get this done before the tech arrives. And I said, and now we're going to have to close down one car wash at a time that we're really busy. So this is why it needed to be done on the midnight shift. And then I had to clarify that the next time I gave him some direction, and especially when I explained why, that needed to be carried out. Eventually, what do you think kind of happened with Trent? He wound up taking on a new opportunity. All right, he had numerous issues in which he just truly was not a fit for working in a management role. He also didn't like being in the heat. He didn't like being in the cold, and the job was just not suitable for him. All right, so let's talk about pushback now. So I gave you an example of insubordination. Pushback is when simply, you contact maybe, a manager, right? And you'd say, hey, I really want to talk with you about, we're going to put together a plan for such and such. And they say, oh, well, now, wait a minute. I don't think that's going to work. Okay, and they are giving you their opinion. Right? This is what you want from your team. You don't want your team to just say, well, yes, not a problem, we'll do it. And then they walk away and say, that's a really dumb idea. Okay? That's not a good thing. You don't want people just to be yesing you all the time as a leader. But what you have to recognize is pushback is very, very different than insubordination. Insubordination was when someone just completely doesn't carry out a directive. Okay? Very different. Encourage opinion, right, but have accountability around the insubordination. Okay. So now, moving on to another mistake. All right. Avoiding confrontation. Okay? Oh boy. So we talked about this earlier with why leaders don't really like the accountability thing. All right, well, it is uncomfortable, but you have to start getting a little more comfortable with being uncomfortable, because if you avoid handling situations, well, what happens? When you just avoid, do situations with employees get better? Oh, no. I mean, imagine if you have a problem at home and you've had a disagreement with your spouse. If you just don't ever address it, is that going to get better? No, it's just going to continue to be very quiet, right? You're going to need to address it. All right, same thing. The other thing we have to be careful of, too, is, communicating in language that is the they versus we. Okay, All right, so let me use this example. I had a manager named Deb who used to work for me. I used to work for American Express for a number of years before I started my company. And I overheard Deb. I was in on a Saturday morning, and I happened to be walking by a sea of cubicles in a large call center that was a customer service center in Phoenix. And Deb was sitting down with an associate who was allowed to try out for a sales team. This associate came from customer service, had a chance to try out for 90 days on our consultative sales team, and no harm, no foul. If you didn't meet the certain requirements, then you would just rotate back to your servicing team, not a problem. Well, the problem was this associate didn't meet the metrics required to stay there, but Deb, I overheard her say, all right, well, Caroline, if it were up to me, well, I would keep you on my team, but you see, they, meaning the directors, and well, specifically Natalie, well, she said, you can't stay on my team, and you have to go back to your other servicing team. What's that called? What did she do to me? Threw me under the bus, big time. And so I then addressed it. And when she saw me kind of turn the corner, she had a bit of a shocked look on her face. And I said, Deb, when you're through, I'd like to see you in the conference room. And then I talked with her about that. And I said, look, Deb, when you're part of the leadership team, there's really no they at all, right? And I said, when you did that, it was because you were uncomfortable having that discussion with the employee, weren't you? Said, all you had to do was just reiterate what the requirements were and that she just simply did not meet the requirements to stay on this team. But I said, instead of you being candid and transparent with the associate, said you really kind of pointed the finger to blame me and the other directors. And I said, very unfair, don't you think? And I said, I think you owe me an apology. And then she did. And I said, this is something that we need to work on. All right, so just remember that there is no they when you're in leadership, okay? We. Okay, now let's talk about the differences between employee concerns and serious complaints. We need to get clear on managing employee relations and kind of who owns what. All right, so first of all, when you are dealing with an employee who might be upset about something, the first thing we need to do is avoid taking sides. Okay, so this is what we don't want to do. We don't want to say something like, well, Kelly, I can hear what you're saying, but, I've worked with Joanna for years, right? She's a pretty good supervisor. If you're Kelly and you're coming forth and you are having some concerns, how are you feeling about now? Not very good. You're kind of feeling like the boss is already taking sides. Stay neutral, right? Stay neutral, don't take sides, you want to listen. There's a reason why we were born with two of these and one of these. We need to use them, okay? All right. We have to listen also to the complainant and not get into a credibility discussion and focus on the complaint itself, not on the complainant. Do some of you have employees who tend to be a little bit more chronic complainers? Frequent flyers, shall we? Okay, all right. So I realized that sometimes I had a woman who worked for me named Maxine, all right, and yes, it can be a little, as my late mother-in-law would say, who was from Atlanta, very trying. She was from Atlanta. I had that kind of very soft southern accent. It was lovely, but it could be very trying. All right, but you have to really take each situation as a standalone, right? But now if you've had, repeated patterns over and over again, then that might be a separate conversation. And maybe the employee really is very disengaged and very unhappy, and hence the reason for the complaining. Let's maybe figure out, is there a better place maybe? Maybe this employee's a mismatch for the role that they're in. I'm not sure. But what we have to do is treat every complaint as a standalone, all right? Now, let's talk about concerns and complaints, right? The things that are on the left screen here, concerns, these are things that really need to be owned by managers, all right? But a lot of times what happens when employees come to HR, they're coming to HR with these things, aren't they? All right? Balance of workload, departmental processes, scheduling. They don't like the way someone spoke to them, all right? Well, okay, HR can get involved in some things, but we need to have some boundaries. I can tell you from spending time in a lot of large organizations, most recently, I was with a big global team of HR professionals. Unfortunately, what's happening is they're getting involved in things that are not really the formal complaints. They're getting involved in too much departmental stuff. And over time, the burden has become so heavy. A lot of folks who work in human resources struggle with their own work-life balance. Why? Because everyone is sort of so conflict averse, they kind of want HR to sort of manage their workplace relationships for them. All right? Okay, so how many of you have children? Kids? Okay. What happens if one of your children, they come home and they tell you, well, Mom or Dad, well, I've got this bully at school. And they tell you all about it, and then you tell your son, let's say your daughter, well, you tell me the next time that happens, and then I'm going to go down to that school, and then I'm going to go take care of that bully myself. What are you teaching your children? Yeah, you're not building their capability, are you? You are not educating and providing good development, human development. Conflict is going to be a part of their lives. But if you're always going to be there as that backstop to fix it, it's no different than if your child has a science project at school and procrastinates, and now it's due tomorrow morning, and now you're making a paper-mache volcano at midnight. What are you teaching your kids? That they don't have to be accountable. Okay? So careful. That's a little bit of what it's like in the work environment today, and too much is going to human resources. All right, so let's kind of recap. Complaints are those things that are of a more serious nature on the right side of the screen, and policy, procedure, legal issues, laws, those need to go to human resources. The concerns and all of the things that you see on the left over here, that's the stuff the managers really need to own, right? So this is where sometimes it can be a little uncomfortable because you have to kind of navigate through that conflict. But big difference between concerns and complaints. All right, so let's identify the difference. How do we do it? By asking good, open-ended questions. So when an employee comes to you, you want to listen carefully, right? We talked about this. Listen to it this morning. Be present. Right? Listen, and if you are really too crazy busy that in that moment you cannot be present to listen, then what should you do? Reschedule, right? Your employees, you need to be respectful, all right? They have something that's a concern, so be respectful. Take notes, right? Ask probing questions, the who, what, where, when, why, how, and assess the seriousness of what's going on. Determine if we're concerned territory here, that's something going on in your department, or if this is something that goes over the fence to human resources, right? But we've got to ask really, really good questions. So here's an example. Let's say we have manager Caroline. She's, let's say, the second level manager. All right, so there's a frontline leader, and then Trina is a frontline employee. All right, Trina's coming to her with an issue with her supervisor, Patrice. So what Caroline says is, okay, please share me exactly what your supervisor said. So what we're doing is asking an open-ended question. Let's gather some facts. Okay, so Trina says, well, my supervisor disrespected me during the staff meeting, blamed me for starting an argument with Matthew. So this is the crux of the matter. Okay, so in trying to assess this, what we have to be doing, all right, is recapping a little bit to make sure we understood. Okay, Patrice, you said that, or Trina, you said Patrice disrespected you. What specifically did she say, okay, that caused you to feel she violated, guess what, our policy, right? Go back to policy. And how exactly did she blame you, right? So when we ask open-ended questions, we're gathering facts, okay? Super important. All right, now if you recognize the employee's issue is really more of a departmental concern, okay, then you want to provide some coaching, some mentorship, maybe even help the employee resolve it directly with the frontline supervisor, okay? But also, empathy goes a long way, right? A phrase like, I understand, Trina. Hey, look, I can tell you're upset. All right. Now, what sometimes managers will do is be dismissive and say, oh, look, you just don't know how to take Patrice. See? Don't be dismissive. All right. Let me give you an example. So a friend of ours, his name is Steve. We call him T-Rex. He's kind of a big guy, former command sergeant major, served with my husband. So his wife, Chris, at this time in their life, she was a stay-at-home mom, and their daughter, Tegan, was in middle school. And Chris decided the one day to bake these really elaborate cupcakes. She kind of did her whole Martha Stewart thing to make the cupcakes really beautiful. Put them in the cupcake tin, and she was doing an activity at Tegan's school. Well, along the way, someone swerved. She had to hit the brakes. What do you think happened to the cupcakes? Okay. She was horrified because, of course, the other moms had brought things in that were really great, and they looked so beautiful, and what she saw was just a hot mess. So at the end of the day, she was still stewing about it and a bit upset, and she got a little kind of teary-eyed because she just really wanted to be proud of this. Steve comes home from work, and so she's crying, and he says, well, what's the matter? So she tells him about the cupcakes. Okay, he works at the Army Reserve Medical Command. He's kind of got an important job. So you can imagine when he explains the cupcake disaster, what do you think his response was? It's only cupcakes. Yeah, okay. Not a good thing, right? So that's what I'm talking about here. Sometimes when you have employees who come to you, it's their cupcake situation, right? And in their world, in their mind, it is important. And belittling that is not a good thing. Okay, similar example. My father I talked about. My dad has a 62 Studebaker Hawk. It's a very cool car, Tiffany blue, kind of robin's egg blue. And a number of years ago, he was working on trying to run some electrical wires through the car, and he was having fits with it. And so he comes in, and my stepmom, who was quite the baker and a cook, was in the kitchen, and he's just complaining about it. And she said, Danny, just call Shelby, who was his mechanic. Just call Shelby, and he'll fix it for you. Like, what's the problem? Same situation. So it isn't always just women in something like baked goods. It is also gentlemen in working on a car or something like that. She was very much belittling it. In her mind, it's just silly. Why? It's not that important. Okay, we have to recognize that the things going on with our employees are important to them. Okay, just like when your kids come to you and they talk about things that may seem rather trivial, it's important to them. So we have to be respectful and we have to listen. Okay? So always acknowledge someone's feelings. That's one of the first steps in conflict resolution, is acknowledging how somebody else feels. Don't belittle it. Don't say, oh, it's only cupcakes or it's only electrical wiring, okay? Acknowledge the feelings. It goes a long way. All right, so the manager here could then say to Trina, who's upset, what steps have you taken to resolve this with Patrice? Okay, now, when you say that to an employee, you're usually going to get a little pushback. They're usually going to say, well, you just don't understand. She doesn't listen. Okay, all right. So they become distressed because when you start questioning, they are beginning to feel the vibe that maybe you're going to expect them to be accountable to manage the issue on their own. Okay, employees today often abdicate responsibility for conflicts. Okay, but it's dysfunctional, isn't it? It's like going to a marriage counselor if you're having difficulty and you say to the counselor, well, I'd like you to fix this, but I don't ever really want to talk to my husband about it. How does that work? You can't resolve conflict without the parties involved. All right. So we have to make sure employees understand the need to work their relationships, right? They can't just abdicate it to others. So be supportive, but yet assertive, right? And letting them know that they own, and something that I often say is you own your relationship with your supervisor. You own your relationship with your peer, okay? All right. So in managing trepidation, what we want to do is redirect the conversation, right? Let's help to find some solutions. So if I'm sitting down with Trina, if I'm Caroline, I'm going to say, Trina, look, I understand you're being uncomfortable. I get that, right? Again, acknowledging her feelings. Now, what I can do is, tell you what, I'll talk with Patrice. I'll get back with you on some next steps. However, all right, we're going to need to have a sit down, the three of us, right? Sometimes they will say, but why can't you just talk with her for me? Okay, that's an example of an employee abdicating. You can't allow that to happen today. They have to own their relationships, okay? So after having that, you get her side of the story, the frontline supervisor. It could be a very different perspective than what Trina has told you, okay? Gather facts, and then you're going to need to figure out how to work out the issue. So in a little bit, I'm going to talk with you about a mediation discussion and how to set that up and give you some how-to skills there. Now, if you find that you're not really at what I call a readiness level means you've had the appropriate development or training to know how to sit down to do that. Hey, that's what your HR team is for, right? They are here to offer you the guidance and the mentorship so that you know how to do these things. Right? Certainly, I didn't have all the wisdom that I have at my 58 years old that I did when I was a young operations manager working in the Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, right? I didn't have all of that back then. That came through mentorship. And thankfully, there were some very, very good mentors that smoothed my rough edges when I was a young manager. I had quite a few, I might add. All right. So here are some words that are going to help you to decide when you're dealing with employee concerns, complaints, how do you decide really what does need to go to human resources, okay? Policy, procedure, or legal issues. Those are the things that rise to the level really of HR. So allegations of harassment. Perhaps someone alleges that they haven't been paid overtime wages and they worked it. A manager told them they can't take their leave under family and medical leave. Those are very serious things. Or there are certain procedures that aren't being followed. Those are the things that go to human resources. All right? So the risk of HR getting involved too much in departmental concerns, well, it increases the potential for this situation to intensify. Right? If HR is getting right in the middle of it, it's also illustrating that HR fights everyone's battles. That's a bit of what I call an enabling behavior. It can also really decrease the productivity of the HR group as well. All right? Careful. This is like the parent example where you go to the school and you're going to deal with the bully with your child, okay? And do it for them instead of coaching them around how maybe to handle that. Okay, careful. Now, what about senior leaders or mid-level leaders? What if you always swoop in and just fix it with frontline employees stepping over the frontline leader? What's the problem with that? What does that do? It's undermining your frontline supervisor, right? You have to be supportive. If your frontline supervisor, for those of you who are more senior or level or mid-level, if your frontline supervisor might be struggling, then help to get them to the readiness level they need to be. But doing it for them is like you being up at midnight doing the papier-mâché volcano, right? You can't do it for them. You have to give them the encouragement, the guidance, or even the necessary training. But always swooping in to fix it for them isn't teaching them how. You're not building their capability. You're not giving them the proper development that they also deserve. Okay? All right. So now, best practices in managing issues here. The first step is defining, are we dealing with concerns that are more departmental in nature that managers need to own, or are we dealing with a policy, procedure, or legal issue that should be more of a complaint? Okay? Let's figure that out. Keep an open mind, right? Don't take sides, even if someone's a frequent flyer, right? Don't jump to conclusions. Gather facts. All right, what kind of questions are you going to ask to gather facts? Who? What, where, when, why, how, right on, okay? And then be neutral when handling issues, right? Neutral territory. All right. Now, let's move into some strategies for conflict management. Okay, how many of you have dealt with employee conflicts? Lots of you, huh? Okay. So, when it comes to dealing with conflict, yes, it can be uncomfortable, all right? So, the first thing is acknowledging those feelings, right? As I said before, you've got to use a little bit of empathy, all right? But clarify your understanding of the situation. Don't just jump to the conclusion either. Don't make assumptions. When you say something like, I can see this situation as upsetting to you, or I can see this as frustrating for you, a little empathy. But if I'm understanding you correctly, you're most concerned about, and then confirm that. If it's a little off base, okay, then perhaps I heard something differently. Let me make sure I understand the situation, okay? That's important. That's also important with your kids, too, because I can tell you with raising my son, he's 32, almost 33 now, but when he would come home, yeah, especially after football practice, there's a lot he's unpacking over Tostino's pizza rolls, right? He ate them by the pound when he was in high school. All right, but sometimes they unpack quite a few things. All right, prioritize. What are you most concerned about? And let's work through that, then let's get on to the other, right? Summarize. Okay. So I like to look at conflict and resolving conflict in different levels. The first one is providing that capability, right? It's coaching the employee on how to resolve it, or if you're an upper level manager, coaching your frontline supervisor on how to do something, okay? So this is giving them the words of wisdom, advice, counsel, mentorship to build their capabilities so they can resolve it on their own. Always a better strategy, yeah? All right. So one of the things that I didn't mention before that you may not know is that I have a podcast called the HR Investigations Podcast. So I'd encourage you to listen, especially to an episode with a gentleman named Mike Panabianco. He is he's a captain for Southwest Airlines. And we talked a lot about the different levels of conflict management. Can you imagine being on an airline, the conflict? Yes, as a captain, he deals with it every single day, right? So it was a very insightful podcast, so I'd encourage you to check it out. All right, so in level one, what we're doing is explaining also to an employee or frontline supervisor, why is it best for you to resolve it one-on-one, okay? Well, generally when you get more people involved in a conflict, what happens? It gets complicated, right? It gets bigger. So the most effective strategy is one-on-one, but often people want to avoid it. But it's usually better to kind of nip that in the proverbial bud, kind of one-on-one, right? So provide perspective on why this is so beneficial. And also, what you're doing here is providing a model, right? A lot of people really don't necessarily have good conflict management skills. Right? One of the employees that used to work for me named Leslie said, honestly, Natalie, I was the baby, and I was the only girl in a family with all my brothers. There were 8 of us. Leslie learned the louder she yelled, the more she wailed, the more that she actually got her way. I want more mashed potatoes, and I want them now, right? She kind of learned to be somewhat demanding. That was the model that she kind of had. And also some of her brothers who would just sort of, yell or grab. Okay. Unfortunately, that was not serving Leslie in her career as a manager, and she was coming across very, very aggressively at times. And we had to kind of, again, smooth rough edges. That was my job, all right? Okay, so what you're going to get is sometimes pushback. When you're trying to help someone resolve a conflict on their own, they're going to say, but why can't you do that? Why can't you talk to her for me? Okay, this is again the empathy. All right, in using Caroline and Trina's scenario here, Trina's struggling with her relationship with her frontline soup, Patrice. Okay, Trina says, look, again, empathy. I understand your trepidation in sitting down with your supervisor. However, you do need to be involved to work this out, okay? All right? You own your relationship with Patrice. Okay. Now, when do you shift to a level 2? Okay, sometimes you're not going to be successful at that kind of level 1, right? You're just not. It could be that the parties involved are not at a good readiness level. Maybe you have a frontline supervisor that perhaps has just not got the right temperament, right? Imagine Leslie, who was a bit rough around the edges and hadn't had the proper training to try to resolve it with an employee. She might have sort of bowled over them. Okay, so strategy number 2, going up a level, is where you figure out who else might need to be involved. Okay, level 2 could be a mediation, okay? So what exactly is a mediation? Have any of you ever been part of one? Yeah. Both parties have an opportunity to kind of air their grievances. And the person who is the mediator is that neutral party to hear both sides, and then let's navigate to an outcome where we resolve it, hopefully, okay? All right, so a lot of times HR will be the mediator, all right? But in some cases, it could even be the upper level leader. What we want to have is adequate time scheduled. Don't try to get through a mediation meeting in 10 minutes. We need to figure out the amount of time that would be appropriate, maybe an hour, hour and a half. It just depends on the circumstances, okay? Make sure the purpose is clear. When you're scheduling it on calendars, purpose should be clear, all right? Why are we going to meet? Okay, so here are the steps. All right, the first one is rules of engagement. This also means civility. Civility, respect, and also reinforcing organizational values and policies. If we're going to sit down and have this chat, we're not going to be out here deviating from our values and the way that we treat one another, right? Each person then describes their view of the conflict, right? And then everybody gets clear on exactly what the disagreement really is, okay? All right. So then we move on. So let's say there's a little bit of kind of a kerfuffle in the middle, and it gets a little tense. I might say, if I'm the mediator, Patrice, look, I'm going to interject here. Look, we agreed at the beginning of the meeting, our rules of engagement is that we were going to conduct ourselves respectfully and civilly. You recall that, correct? Okay, now we're going to give Trina the opportunity to have the floor. Okay, so if you do that and you move forward, great. Sometimes you might have to do that 2-3 times and redirect. All right, so once you then hear both sides, now you're looking for the common ground. All right, then we're moving forward into the next step. All right, you ask each person to describe the actions that they'd like someone else to take. All right, so maybe Trina says, well, I would really appreciate it if Patrice wouldn't say stuff like correcting me in front of the other team members. All right, Patrice, is that something you would be able to agree to? Okay, sure, right? See what I mean? You're getting them to agree. Then you maybe even generate some suggestions. Well, what do you think about? Maybe Patrice, the next time there is something like this that comes up, you just pull her right into the conference room. Is that something you can agree to? All right, so you want to generate some suggestions. Okay. All parties agree and then commit, and they're going to resolve the conflict. They thank one another, and sometimes even you have a little bit of a lighter mood at the end. I often find that. Okay. So you appreciate them working on this issue and coming to common ground. All right? Then what do you think is necessary at the end? Document. You want to note the dates, the date, the time, and the details of what was discussed. So then later, if this situation resurfaces, you can say, hey, back on April the 9th, if you recall, we had this conversation, and these were the things you agreed to, and now someone is deviating from what was agreed to. All right? So that can be super helpful. Okay, so now when do you go to a level 3? All right, level 3 is a skip level. All right, skip level means this frontline supervisor, Patrice, Trina, that's not going to work. What we might do is Trina and then upper level supervisor. All right, let's say that upper level supervisor's name is Damon. We're going to sit down Damon and Trina, and it may be that HR doesn't have to be involved. Other times, maybe HR does need to be involved. But this is, again, where you have to assess readiness levels. If sometimes, if you go this route and you try to push it, sometimes it can actually go the other way. And it could actually create more conflict because the parties involved are not at the readiness level to do it. So you have to assess that. And whenever you're not sure, who do you call? HR. Okay, so now let's talk about the leader's role in managing performance, and we're going to start rounding out the presentation today. By the way, we'll take Q&A later on in the afternoon, so if any of you have some questions for me, we're going to address that a little bit later on. Okay, so the leader's role here. I like to show this picture of a wheel on a sailboat. Let me back up there. Okay. Whoop. Okay. So how many of you have a boat or have been on a boat? Yeah? Okay. All right. So imagine if you are heading up the Halifax River towards St. Augustine, where the channel gets really, really, really narrow. My husband and I had a boat for a while. It was called the Naughty Dog, D-A-W-G. We're University of Georgia fans. Go Dogs, that's right. Go Bulldogs. Yeah, we are the dog nation at the Ivey household. All right. So I'd never traveled up that particular part of the river, and if you break a propeller on a 45-foot boat, that's not an inexpensive endeavor. So I can tell you, I was a little nervous. Where's my husband on the bow of the boat? What's he doing? Giving me course corrections. Come to starboard a few degrees. Go to port. And then he would say a little. Okay, can you define what a little to port is? Okay, what's a little? And I said, give me feet, dear. Okay. You need to go about 3 feet this way, or how many degrees? Okay. So leaders are responsible for communicating and giving direction to employees and giving them you're on the right heading, or we need to come a few degrees to starboard, a few degrees to port, right? We have to have that responsibility. That's part of nurturing, if you will, our people. If we're not doing that, then we're kind of leaving them to flounder, to just kind of wind up on the shoals, right? And that would be an expensive endeavor if you wind up with your boat stuck up on the Halifax River. So this is a framework for what I call the feedback model, all right? So to give a little bit of that course correction, this is a framework for the conversation, all right? And you'll also get a copy of this presentation later, so you can refer back to this. But you want to clarify exactly what somebody said or did. So let's say I have an employee named Michelle that I have to get a little course correction, so we're not going to wind up in the shoals, okay? Specifically, I've noticed Michelle, and what needs to change is, and here's the reason it needs to change, you have to explain what the consequences are for, let's say, not changing. And then commitment. What can I do to help you? And then also ask for their commitment too. What are some immediate things that you're going to work on, let's say, in this area? All right, so here's an example, and documenting the conversation. So I know a lot of you probably over the years in interactions with human resources, you've heard them say over and over again, well, where's your documentation? Have you heard that? Okay, why is that? Why do we need documentation when we're managing employee issues?
Otherwise it's just hearsay.
Yeah, it's just hearsay, and the old saying, if it isn't written down, it never happened. Okay, exactly. And so if I've had to have a conversation with Michelle, in this case, it happens to be an attendance issue, This is an example of how you bullet point, summarize what it is that we talked about. All right, so maybe she's been coming in late, perhaps it's been a childcare issue, but then also I've asked, what can I do to help? And so maybe it's an adjustment in shift. Maybe it's an adjustment in her schedule with off days, right? Who knows? But you are involved as a leader in problem solving, right? Too many times I find that supervisors just leap to, well, I'm just going to write you up. Yeah, okay, you can do that. But is that really being compassionate, right? Is that, no, that takes the human part out of human resources, or the people part out of employee relations, right? There are issues and challenges sometimes people have, and as leaders, it's our responsibility to get in there and figure it out. But we also have to memorialize these discussions, because you are an organization and you do have to have documentation to insulate you from the risk, right? So we want to, of course, accomplish results, accomplish objectives, but at the same time we have to balance that risk that we talked about. All right, so that's an example how to document. So let's talk about some key takeaways from the presentation this morning. All right, I began this morning by talking about people infrastructure and using the example of my nephew Ryan, right, and how he has to take care of the infrastructure at Hershey Park. Make sure things are lubricated, make sure that the chains don't have a chink in it, that all the preventive maintenance is done so that the rides are operating safely. Okay, and that the amusement park doesn't have some rides shut down, all right? Bad day if the super duper looper is down, all right? So we have to make sure we are aligned with our mission, right, our vision, and also our values. But it also means that we've got to focus on both. We have to focus on the accomplishing of the results, but at the same time balancing risk. And risk is also making sure that we're going to hold on to good, talented employees. We don't want to lose some of those good employees. We also don't want to make any missteps that's going to possibly invite legal risk, all right? That's pretty expensive, right? I shared, with a group recently, not only the average cost billable hourly rate for an attorney is $500 to $550 an hour, but these days, even just dismissals and some of the EEO types of claims, these can be substantial. Retaliation claims can be upwards of $450,000. That's a lot of money. Think about what an organization can do, with those funds instead of it being, kind of right out the window. All right, we have to be mindful of concerns and complaints. We have to really ask good open-ended questions. Let's figure out what we need to own as leaders versus what things need to be escalated to HR, all right? And don't avoid conflict, right? No avoidance, all right? Enforce your organizational values through accountability, document, and lastly, there's no they in leadership, there's only we. All right. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you being with me. Thank you. All right.